Well, we are in Genesis 25, and we'll just hit some highlights. We'd like to hit some highlights. We've got about 20 minutes, see what we can do there, and do our best to kind of summarize the chapter. We had a pretty exciting chapter this morning. There's wonderful truth in it, and of course, it was a long one. This one, it was 67 verses. This one's 34 verses, so that's pretty good. Anyway, Genesis 25, verse 1. Let's see how it starts off. It says, Abraham again took a wife, and her name was Keturah. And she bore him Zimram, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan begot Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Ashuram, Letisham, and Liam. Anyway, it's with M. Liam Mim. I want to put an N in there. And the sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldaah. All these were the children of Keturah. And Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. But Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, and while he was still living, he sent them eastward away from Isaac his son to the country of the east. Verse 7. This is the sum of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. And it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac. And Isaac dwelt at Beer Lahai Roi. Abraham is going to remarry at about age 140. And, there's a lot of folks, for whatever reason, I guess have just never read the 25th chapter of Genesis. Because some folks say, I didn't know Abraham had other kids. He had a bunch of kids. And, I'm just telling you, I've just got this vivid imagination. If it was bad for, Abraham and Sarah to show up with Isaac, because he has them when he's 100 and she's 90, and I can just see him showing up at school, at PTA and all that kind of stuff. For Abraham to show up with Keturah with all of these kids later on, I don't know. I just got a warped sense of humor, just trying to. But when it says that he was a father of many nations, we're literally mean that. You notice some of those names, they sound a little familiar, don't they? Midian, later on, there's a whole nation named after him. Some of those, you kind of hear some of those later on. They grow beyond the city status. They grow to national status. And then, and we never really thought about it, he had some girlfriends, and we don't even know their names. And we don't even know those kids, and they were sent off. The Word of God tells you the way things are, not the way you want things to be. So you got to make sure you read the whole thing to kind of get a good grasp. You understand Abraham's a great man of faith, but he's not a perfect man. And he had this deep love for the Lord, and what made him so righteous before God is God tell him something, he'd believe God. And he didn't even withhold Isaac from the Lord. But he actually, at this old age, marries again. And it appears bought a home close to a school. That type of thing. In other words, there's a whole other generation. Now, I'm just kidding around, and of course we understand that he always lived as a pilgrim, always lived in tents. But there's a whole other side that a lot of folks don't consider. And the reason is, after this, we don't hear much. But a lot of these folks are related to each other. They get so crossways with each other down the road. And we wouldn't know that unless it's for this chapter. There's a lot of things down the road make a lot more sense, if you don't skip this chapter. So it's not one of those exciting chapters with this great deep spiritual truth, but God says, let me tell you why things are the way they are, and they're still that way today. Most folks know the conflict between Isaac and Ishmael, between the Jews and the Arabs. But you can trace other conflict that is here. God says there was only one of these sons that was the son of promise. There's only one of these sons that all nations of the earth would be blessed through. Only one of these sons would actually have the Messiah in his lineage. And of course, that's Isaac, the child of promise, where God had to do something. Boy, once God touched Abraham's body, because we've already been told it was dead at 100. God had to touch his body and had to touch Sarah's body for them to be able to have Isaac. Boy, once God touched Abraham, he didn't wear out, did he? I mean, he's going to remarry and have a whole batch of kids. That was a work right until his dying day. That was more than just a while. I mean, when God touched his body, he did something there, didn't he? And a lot of times we just don't think about it. All the inheritance goes to Isaac. Now, there were gifts that were given to these other sons, and they were designated areas, and they were sent to other areas. But the land, the promised land, which had been promised to him, that promise is transferred through Isaac. It's not transferred through Ishmael. It's not transferred through Medan. It's not transferred through Midian. It's not transferred through anyone else. The promise is through Isaac. And this is by God's choosing. And so we can trace that. And that's why this promise is still good today. God has never taken it away. And God is good to his word. God doesn't forget. God's not bound by time. It says, Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had while he was still living, and he sent them eastward away from Isaac his son to the country of the east. It says, this is the sum of the years of Abraham's life when he lived 175 years. So it appears he remarries for a period of about 35 years, very end of his life, and he dies. Wow, I mean, that's a long life. Okay, we're talking about the time of the patriarchs. And we're going to see several of the ones that get to these ages. So it says, he breathed his last, died in a good old age, an old man full of years, and was gathered to his people. And his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite. We studied that when his wife dies, and he enters into an agreement, and he actually has, he makes a purchase of what we would call a family plot, and they're going to use that for a number of generations. Things aren't all that different today that they were then. A lot of times folks get together for funerals and weddings. Even folks who don't talk to each other too much, funerals and weddings. So you kind of hold your breath, don't you, sometimes? Just hoping everybody's on their best manners for the time. But it says that Isaac and Ishmael come together to bury their dad. Isaac will be 75 when his dad dies. Ishmael will be 90 when that happens. Remember, there's that difference in their ages. It says, there Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. Now, according to Peter, Abraham and Sarah, their relationship is something that we are taught to emulate, or something that we're to try and shoot for. Let me read, this is out of 1 Peter chapter 3. But in 1 Peter chapter 3, and there's a teaching that the Holy Spirit gives through the Apostle Peter on how husbands and wives are supposed to treat one another, and then there's some examples. So 1 Peter 3:1, it says, wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. We're talking about a reverence. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. For in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. And here's the example, and since we're studying this, it's clear in our thoughts. Verse 6 says, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, if you do good and are not afraid with any terror. Husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another, love as brothers, be tender-hearted, be courteous, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. Now, we're all together, so we all behave ourselves, and we all are on good manners. But if you're all by yourself and you never read that and you only grew up outside the church, you will read that passage and you say, this guy must be smoking something. This guy must be out of his head. And if I teach this in my culture, they're going to laugh me off the stage. There's going to be all sorts of stuff they'll throw at me before, I can get out of there. This is God Almighty speaking directly, and this word applies to our generation. It applies to the city of El Paso. It applies to each one of us. God doesn't play favorites from one generation to the next. And he's not soft on sin. He doesn't say, oh, it's 2020. You live in El Paso. Oh, I don't expect so much from you. I expect less from y'all. But everybody else, this word applies to them. It applies to all of us. God always takes a very high standard of marriage. And he's speaking to imperfect people, finite people. He's speaking to Abraham and Sarah. A lot of folks say, Abraham and Sarah. Well, we'd already discovered a few things about Abraham that seemed a little strange when he would allow his wife, he'd say, tell him you're my sister. And she was his half-sister. And at first that seemed a little strange to us today. Then we find out later on, of course, he has these other experiences. But it is because of what God did inside of Abraham and Sarah. He changed them from the inside out. They continued to grow in fellowship with the Lord. They were not perfect people, but they learned how to be people of faith. And they learned how to bless one another. And God says, I want you to think about Abraham and Sarah as a good example of a husband and wife, something that you can shoot for in difficult circumstances and difficult times. They lived in difficult times, a lot of idolatry, and there was a lot of, hey, I want what you've got, so I'll kill you. I want your camels, I'll take them, I'll kill you. I want your wife, I'll kill you. I want your land, I'll kill you. That was a reality. The stuff happened. It was not an easy time. We know that things got so bad, of course, Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. So that's a pretty rough situation if God says, I'm not going to let this happen one more day, where we're going to change this situation right away. It wasn't an easy time that they lived in. But God says, I want my people to think about them. And God uses them as a man who really loved his wife. I know he did some stupid things there a couple of times. And that Sarah really did have a deep respect for her husband. And he says, what they discovered is that real beauty comes from the inside and not the outside. It's the hidden person that's inside being able to shine forth in lifestyle. See, when we get saved, we know how to do everything wrong. We know how to do everything in the flesh. You make me hurt, I know how to make you hurt. And I can be real slick about it. I don't have to argue right away because you're bigger than me and maybe you can run faster than me, but I'm not about to forget. And when I let you have it, you'll never know what hit you. But it'll happen with a smile. You and I, we are that kind of people. Well, God has to change us, doesn't he? He has to change us from the inside out. And he does. He really does make that change. It says, in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive. It says the way they were known for, it says, what you should be known for is the hidden person of the heart with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. A gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God, is because they're rare. The rarer something is, the more it costs. That is extremely rare to find folks who are so controlled by the Lord to have a gentle and quiet spirit. That's not where we start off. That's where we're supposed to end up. And so it says Sarah obeyed Abraham. Doesn't mean she always agreed with him. Called him Lord, and that's not in a fake way or anything. It says, whose daughters you are if you do good and are not afraid with any terror. In other words, he didn't threaten her. If you don't treat me this way, then Abraham didn't abuse his wife and did not treat her abusively. And husbands, we are told, are to dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as the weaker vessel. And I have to explain that and what that means and what it doesn't mean. It certainly doesn't mean physically, because I know some ladies that could beat the tar out of their husband. Right? I mean, we're not talking in physical terms here. So, I mean, what do you mean weaker vessel? What are you talking about? And there's a saying that you may be familiar with, that men are tin cups and women are fine china. Men are tin cups and women are fine china. And you can kind of bang guys around, you can toss them around, all sorts of stuff. There's a different way of looking at things. A weaker vessel, it doesn't mean cheaper. It means more expensive, more pressure, more precious. A weaker vessel. Think of fine china. In other words, if you got this tin cup that's here, and then you've got this fine china, and it's a dime for the tin cup, and it's $10 for that fine china, you got to be kidding! They both hold 8 ounces. I mean, what's the big deal? Well, this is the weaker vessel. This is the more precious vessel. This is fine china. That's the terminology that's being used. It says, man, you better appreciate what you have. Especially if you have a wife with a precious, with a gentle and quiet spirit. I said, you do not know how precious that is. And you had better treat her that way. This description in 1 Peter 3, which goes back to the example of Abraham and Sarah, seems so strange in our culture that most people will not even seriously listen to teachings out of that chapter. Jesus already has to get their attention before they will even consider it. They have to be born anew, born again, before they would say, okay, maybe there's something about marriage that I didn't pick up in the flesh, or they didn't tell me about in public school, or I never saw in practice around me. Maybe Jesus knows more than I know. And he does, because marriage, of course, is his idea. Well, let's go back to Genesis 25. I can see that I'm not getting hardly anywhere where I need to be. Let me just tell you, because we just got a few minutes to wrap up, the next several verses are going to give the genealogy of Ishmael. And he's going to live to be 137. And he's going to have 12 sons. Now, generally, you are aware that Jacob out there is going to have 12 sons, and we're going to have the 12 tribes of Israel, but Ishmael had 12 sons. And if you don't know that, and you don't know their heritage, I promise you your Muslim friends do. And they take it right out of the same Bible that you read. In other words, this hasn't been made up somewhere else. This is not only in their writings, I mean, it comes right out of the book of Genesis. So God gives us a heritage, kind of where, once, from Abraham, how these nations come forth. It's why Abraham is claimed by folks who are Jewish, folks who are Muslim, and folks who are Christian. He's claimed as a man of faith, as a friend of God, as one who is made righteous before God, because when God spoke to him, he did exactly what was there. If you keep going, we have the genealogy of Isaac that is listed next. And we need to read a passage before we leave. We're going to need to read verses 19 through 26. And here's what it says in Genesis 25. This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now this morning we noticed they were in what we call northern Mesopotamia, kind of falls in the area of Iraq. They were referred to as Syrians. Not exactly the Syria of today, but you understand the area. About 450 to 500 miles away, because that's how far Abraham had to send his servant to where this is at. It says, Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. You know, they'd been married about 19 years, and they'd been trying, and she just couldn't come up with a child. And he pleaded, give us a child. Well, she does come up with a child. She'd never experienced pregnancy, but here's what happened. It says, verse 22, but the children struggled together within her. Children. She ended up with twins. And she said, if all is well, why am I like this? So she went to inquire of the Lord. It's her first pregnancy. She doesn't know what it's supposed to feel like. But she said something, this just can't be normal. This cannot be normal. We really wanted kids, but this is ridiculous. And the Lord spoke to her and said, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 people shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. Well, they didn't have all the technology we had today to see, all that kind of stuff. But God said, there's 2. It says the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over, so they called his name Esau. He's hairy. Okay? Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob, which means supplanter. He was trying to ride on the guy. He's trying to pull him back. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So that's why we said they'd been married about 19 years, finally conceived, and when they at the point where they've been married 20 years, they have these twins. And so we discover already, since we trace all of us all the way back to Adam and Eve, and of course on this side of the flood we trace everybody back to Noah's 3 sons. Because within our DNA, there's great diversity. You got 2 boys, but they don't look alike. They are twins, aren't they? But they're not identical twins. And they were different. Boy, one was kind of dark and swarthy and said he was a hairy fella, and the other one had lighter skin, and he was kind of... And so the one they called hairy, Esau. And the other, because he was hanging on. He was trying to, pull on his brother. They called him supplanter, Jacob. And that's as far as we get to go. We're out of time. But God says you need to know this for what's coming. So this is kind of one of those chapters God just sort of fills in some details that you have to remember when we get to something that's down the road. So you just have to say, okay, because at first you say, now why do I really need to know this? There's a whole bunch of names we skipped in there. But you'll be able to trace all sorts of nationalities once you know what's back here. If you know what's in Genesis 10, and then you know what's in Genesis 25, wow, you can track an awful lot of history, and things make a whole lot more sense. And God tells us exactly where these groups come from and how they were dispersed and which directions that they went. Y'all have been real patient. Let's pray.